Okay, so so our final topic today is covering Scenario Manager. Just going over what it is and how you can go about implementing it in your projects. So using Scenario Manager, you can create a base network file like you would typically do, but then you can use this tool to easily create network variations. So maybe you want to create different time of days like AM or PM or different geometries. And then you can easily compare these networks with one another and contain all of these changes within a single file. So this just makes it a little bit easier just to keep track of all the changes that have been made. And it also makes it easier if you're collaborating on others, just to keep track and just have all of the files located in one place. So here are some different use cases for Scenario Manager. You could use this for geometry updates, like an interchange design or different construction phasing. You could also use this for time of day. So maybe you have AM versus PM, or maybe looking at different demand years. So like current 2020 versus maybe 2035. And also for maybe upgrading different intersections. So maybe you have a stop controlled and you want to look at signalizing that, or maybe using a roundabout. Or if you also want to take a look at different multimodal applications, for example, you may want to add transit to a network and see what the impacts are, look at adding in a bus rapid transit lane, or maybe applying some transit signal priority to see how that will impact the network. So here's the recommended workflow for using Scenario Manager. First off, we'll build the base network. So this will just contain all of your roadway geometry, all of your links and connectors, your speed decisions, reduced speed areas, any of your base signal files, really anything that you would just include in kind of your base starting block network. And then this can also be the network that you calibrate and then use for the future scenarios. Once you have that base network built up, you can then go on to make changes to that network. And all of these changes will be created within modification files. So again, this is where you could create maybe an AM demand or PM demand, or add in different network geometry. And then scenarios will take that base network and then apply the selected modifications to create your scenarios. And it's important to note that any changes that you make in the base network will carry over to any scenarios you create. So for example, if maybe you wanted to update speed for all of your scenarios, you could just go back to the base network, make that change once, and it will trickle down and update all of the different scenarios. And then also the base network itself cannot be run to collect simulation results. So if this is kind of like your calibrated network, or you would just want to look at that as a single scenario, you can create a scenario with no modifications. So that will just represent the base network as is. All right, so let's take a look now at how to set up Scenario Manager. So within the File menu, you'll go down to Scenario Management and then select Place under Scenario Management. And that will pop up a window where you can name the project. So this will just update the name for the IMPX file itself. And you can also name your first scenario. Once you do that, Vissim will automatically create some additional folders in your directory. So you'll see a Vissim project database file. So you'll see this .vissim PTV file. And this will actually contain all of the information about the scenarios and the modifications, and will contain all of the descriptions and everything that's included. And then it will also add in some additional folders. So here's where all of your modifications files will be kept. And then when you run the simulation, the scenarios folder will hold all of those results. And then also when you set this up, the Project Explorer toolbar will open up where the network object toolbar typically is. And so you'll see here, this is where you can easily view your base network. You can see the different scenarios and modifications. You can use this to easily switch and open up different items. So you can open up the base network, open up different scenarios and modifications. And at the top here is also the options where you can actually run these files. So this will allow you to run individual scenarios or run all of the scenarios as a group. And then finally, there's an option here on the left, upper left corner to open up the project structure window, which we'll talk about next. So the project structure window just contains some additional information about the base settings, and then also contains additional information for the scenarios and the modifications. So the first tab here for the basic settings, this really just contains a log of any changes that are made. So some of these will be generated automatically. So you can see here we have some scenarios that created and some modifications that were created. But this is also a great tool if you're collaborating on this with others, where you can make notes. So you could say, oh, I started this particular modification or this scenario, but I still need to do this. Or you can make notes like saying, okay, this scenario is completely finished and run. It's just another great way where you can just keep internal notes within the file itself. Okay, so moving on to the modifications. Again, the modifications are really just a set of changes that are made to the base network. So this tab is where you can update the name of the modifications, add additional descriptions, and also create groups. So these groups are just a string of text that you can add, which can be useful if you have a lot of modifications with a lot of different for all of your scenarios. And by naming these groups, you can then sort that group column so they'll all be kind of grouped together. And then finally, you can also set up exclusions and dependencies. So for the exclusions, here I have kind of this example with an AM traffic. So this has like AM inputs and routes, and then we have a PM traffic with PM inputs and routes. So in this case, we really never want a scenario to include both of these traffic options together. So by excluding these from one another, when we go into our scenarios, it's just kind of a secondary check just to make sure that in the future, no one ever tries to create a scenario with both of these options. So this is just really useful just to make sure that nothing gets overwritten, or maybe you make a scenario that doesn't have the correct traffic that you want to add. And then you can also set up dependencies. So this is where if you built, like maybe had some updated roadway geometry, and then maybe you wanted to make some additional changes on top of that, maybe for signal timing, you would really want this signal timing modification to depend upon and be built off of this updated geometry. So by setting this dependency, what will happen is Vissim will load, again, that base network, then it will load this dependent modification, and then it will load number 4. And so again, this is just another great check to make sure when you're adding this to scenarios that wherever you add modification number 4, modification number 3 will also be automatically loaded. So then just to go over the toolbar on the right-hand side, this is where you can easily add new modifications, create duplicates, or delete modifications. And then you can also change the modification loading sequence. So that will actually update this load index here in case you wanted to maybe load a particular modification first. For example, maybe instead of loading the traffic data, you might want to load the geometry. So you could use this to kind of update that load index in more automatic. And then the next two options actually kind of do some additional checks. So if you highlight a couple of modifications, you can check and make sure that they can be uploaded in a scenario together. So it'll just make sure that there are no exclusions. And then The second option here will allow you to check and make sure that the modifications are independent of one another and can be loaded in any order without changing the scenario. And so these are really useful when you do have a lot of modifications, just to do some quick checks without having to go through and look at all of the individual numbers for the exclusions and dependencies. And then finally, you can select additional modification attributes if you want those to show up within this window as well. Okay, and then on the scenario side, again, this is built from the base network and contains a set of modifications. So here you can also update the name and add some additional descriptions. And then this is where you'll also select the modifications to include for each of those scenarios. And so there'll be just a little drop down here that you can select and then check the modifications to use. And again, this is where it's really useful to set up those dependencies and exclusions. For example, if you did try to add 1 and 2 together, this would then prompt you and tell you these are actually excluded, so they can't be used in the same scenario. And then similarly, if you tried to add number 4 alone, it will actually automatically load number 3 since it's dependent on that one. And then over here on the right-hand side, you can also set up different scenarios to compare to one another, which can be used when viewing results just to see how those results changed for each of those scenarios. So pretty similar to the modifications, over on the right-hand side is where you can add, duplicate, or delete scenarios. And then you can also take a particular scenario and actually export it into a separate INPX file. So maybe once you're done with all of your scenarios, or if you wanted to create some additional models from another scenario, you can just export that and it will save it in a separate file. And finally, you can select some additional attributes to display. All right, so some best practices. So when you are putting a model in Scenario Manager, we do recommend creating new modifications and adding and editing those directly, instead of going into a scenario and making edits within that scenario. If you do make edits directly in a scenario, what can happen is that you'll end up with all of these generated automatically modifications, which can be really difficult to debug, and it's also really difficult to keep track of what actually changed. And then it's very difficult to actually use these for any other scenario. So for example, like this first one, maybe just added in the new roadway, and maybe you wanted to put that in all of your scenarios, but when this gets generated automatically, it's very difficult to tell what each of these actually are. And then it is also very important to update those names and descriptions. So even if you do add a new modification, we do recommend going back in and updating the name just to something more recognizable. That way you can easily keep track of what exists within each of the scenarios. And then setting up those dependencies and exclusions for modifications can also help you when you're adding those to different scenarios, just kind of as a second check. And then also if you are adding different signal timing plans, so for example, maybe you have AM timing and PM timing, you will need to create separate controller files. So within the controller window, you'll just need to save that off as a separate file, maybe something like RBC1 AM and RBC2 PM. That way each of those can contain their own timings, and then each of those modifications would just grab and pull in those files individually. And then finally, using this multi-run feature up here at the top is a great way if you've kind of finished creating some initial set of runs, or if you wanted to kind of do a final set, you can use this multi-run feature to run all of your scenarios, and it'll go through and finish running all of the seeds for run 1, and once that's finished, it'll kick down and go to 2 and 3 and so on. So it's a great feature to use if you just wanted to run these overnight and then check on your results in the morning. So we did create a small example file using Scenario Manager. So we built up our base network and used that as our existing scenario case. And then using the base network, we created some modifications. The first thing we did is create a geometry update. So we updated an interchange to use diverging diamond. And then we had to update the routes from there since we moved our links around. And then we finally applied a signal update. So we grouped all of those modifications together to create a build scenario. So let me go ahead and pull up that file. So this will look very similar to the DTA example file we went over earlier, but in this case we did convert everything over to static routes and vehicle inputs. So this is the main interchange that we looked at as part of Scenario Manager. So you'll see over here we have two different scenarios, an existing and a build out. And then we have three different modifications. So if I select this first modification, let's see if that will load. Oh, I am running the simulation, so no, it will not. Okay, so now we will load that. And here's where you can see the diverging diamond interchange that we added here. And then, of course, once we did that, since we did flip and move all the links around and change some of these connections, we did need to update some of the static routes. So we created the second modification, which went in and should have fixed all of the static routes that would travel over these links. And then finally, as part of this, we did make some signal updates. So this includes changes, slightly moved some of the signal head positions, and then added in detectors for each of these. And then as part of that, we also created separate RBC files. So you'll see in here that we have two new ones for numbers 16 and 17. And so I just renamed those with underscore DDI. And that way, this modification references that specific file with this different timing. And so if I open up the project structure in here, you can see that I did add some dependencies. So both the route update and the signal update depend upon that first geometry change. And then in the scenarios tab is where I selected and grouped all those modifications together for the build out scenario. And you can see here, if I unselect everything and I go and select maybe number 2, that'll actually will automatically load modification number 1 with number 2. So again, just taking advantage of those the modification dependencies and exclusions to use for the scenarios themselves. And so then if I go into each of these scenarios, this is where you can actually run the model within the scenario itself. And again, you can either run these individually, or you can use kind of that double play button up here if you wanted to kick off and run all of these at once. And once this does run, just wanted to show you some of the node results. So this is where you can utilize that scenario comparison. If you set that up within the project structure, this is where you can actually select results from the other scenario. So you can look at the specific values or actually differences between the two. And you'll see if I scroll down to the average section that you'll actually start to see some of the different delay values and different vehicle volumes between the two. So for example, here's the vehicle delay for the existing, for the average, and then the vehicle delay for scenario 2, and then the difference between those. So just a way to quickly compare results between your different scenarios.